Good evening. It's good to see each of you here this evening. We are going to begin another series tonight, as we like to do on Sunday evenings, going through a book, if you will, preaching through a book. It's been a while since we finished Nehemiah, and I have been doing some standalone lessons, if you will, on Sunday evening, but it's time to get back to doing a textual study. This is one of my favorite ways of studying the Bible, just picking a book, looking at the historical significance behind it, and then just going through and what does God want me to learn from this. No better way to learn what God would have us to do than to just sit down and read it. And especially a letter that we're going to be going through like Titus. We're going to be studying the book of Titus. The book of Titus is unique in a way, or at least not as common as some of the other ones, in that it's written to an individual. There's very few that are actually addressed to individuals. And so this is very much a letter in the truest sense. And in my opinion, the letter that is written to Titus is a very underappreciated book. And I'll give a couple reasons why I think that way. First, we typically only open the book of Titus when we're doing what? When we're studying elder qualifications, right? And we will have the book of Titus open, we'll have 1 Timothy open, and we'll be comparing and looking at the qualifications of elders, but we don't usually go much past the first few verses in Titus. And when we do that, we leave a lot on the table that is there to be gleaned, that we can benefit from. The letter written to Titus was not just on the qualifications of elders. Yes, that is a part of it that we will address, but there is so much more contained within this very short letter. But a second reason I think that sometimes it is overlooked or underappreciated is it was written to a preacher, right? And we'll have more to say about that in a little bit. But it was written to a preacher. Now, the majority of Christians are not preachers, are they? Not in the traditional sense like I'm doing right now. We should all be teachers, absolutely. We are all called to impart the Word to people. But we are not all in this capacity preachers. And so a lot of times we see the book written to a preacher and we think, well, that's not me. I'm not a preacher, so therefore I'm probably not going to get a whole lot out of it. Right? It was written to a preacher, what he's supposed to do, so I'll go to a different book that maybe is more applicable to me. But I want to submit to you that the lessons contained within this letter are very much applicable to everyone who calls themselves a child of God. Yes, this was written to Titus, who was a preacher and evangelist on the island of Crete, but it was written for those he was ministering to. It was responsibilities that he had towards those that were Christians. And so the principles and the lessons we learn in the letter are going to be for us as Christians. And so that's why I am going to title this series, Living Sound Doctrine. Because that's what we're called to do. That word doctrine in the world of religion is considered almost a dirty word anymore. Doctrine means you're legalistic. It means that there are rules and that you point out when people violate rules. Doctrine means teaching. It just simply means a teaching. As Christians, we are to live according to sound teaching, which comes from God alone. And that's what's going to be displayed in the book. And before I get too far into it, on the back table, I printed out not a handout like I typically do, but it's an outline of the book of Titus that I borrowed from one of the commentaries I have. And I think it does a very good job of just laying out the order of Titus and making it a little bit easier to follow the flow of the letter. So if you would like, feel free to pick up one of those on your way out this evening. But as with other textual studies, I believe it's always good to establish an historical background when approaching a specific book so that the context of the message is given its proper setting. When we understand the who's and the what's, it makes the why a little bit easier to grasp. We're going to begin by discussing the author. Who wrote this book? And it might be easy to say, well, yes, the Apostle Paul. I mean, look at Titus 1 and verse 1. The very first word in the letter is what? Paul. He calls himself out. But critics of the Bible will try to undermine Paul's authorship. They're always doing things like this. They want to take something that is so simple. Paul saying himself, I am writing this. And they say, no, you're not. No. Someone else is writing it and using Paul's name to try to bolster their credibility. It's not really Paul. It's somebody that's writing as him. So how do we answer? Well, first, their argumentation is that the absence of mention of this event in the book of Acts lends credibility to them saying, no, he didn't write it. Because Luke didn't record this happening in Acts during Paul's missionary journey, then it did not take place. To say that is a stretch is an understatement. To make that jump, that just because Luke didn't talk about it in Acts means it didn't happen. Remember the phrase we used this morning? The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Okay, so maybe Luke didn't... Oh, and by the way, this is when Paul wrote to Titus, and this is when Paul wrote to Timothy the first time. Okay. But we're going to say because he did that, then, no, it didn't happen. I want you to notice when Luke closes his record in Acts, the last two verses in Acts chapter 28, verses 30 and 31, he has traced Paul's ministry up to that point. Where is Paul at the end of Acts? He's in Rome, right? He's arrested. He has been imprisoned for preaching the gospel in Rome. And he closes out this account by saying that for 2 years, Paul lived at his own expense in a rented house, having liberties and freedoms. People were able to come to him, and he preached the gospel all the time. Does it say or does it hint to the fact that then Paul died at the end of Acts? Absolutely not. He only closes the letter saying that for 2 years Paul was imprisoned in Rome. And so we have to go beyond Acts to see what happened next. If anything. Did anything come after that, or was Paul's ministry done? In the epistles that he wrote to individuals and to congregations, there are details that can be found that substantiate his release from that first imprisonment and then further ministry that he engaged in. Paul didn't just stop preaching the gospel once he was arrested in Rome. When they let him go, they had no reason to hold him, to charge him to begin with. But when he was released, he got back to work. And he started going around and he was preaching even more the gospel of Christ. And I want to share with you a proposed itinerary of Paul that many different people have put forth. And this itinerary, while being speculative, it does seem to harmonize the details that we find throughout the epistles that Paul wrote. So upon his release, Paul is acquitted in his first imprisonment. We have no reason to charge you. You're not being condemned for anything. You're free to go. And so he continues with his previous plans. And when he wrote to the Philippian brethren, he was confident of his release. In verse 24, he was confident that he was going to be able to come and see them again. It was not wishful thinking necessarily on Paul's part, and I think a lot of times we read that into Paul's statement that, he hopes he gets to come to... No, he was confident that by the system of law at the time, he was going to be released. And he was going to be able to continue with the plans that he had to visit congregations, to establish congregations. And so after his release, he leaves Rome for the area of Asia Minor by way of the island of Crete. And this is where he leaves Titus. Titus has been traveling with him, and he leaves him in Crete because of needs that arise there. But Paul doesn't stay there. He goes to Ephesus. And then from Ephesus, he goes on to Colossae. And we can find this in Philemon in verse 22, that was the plan that Paul had. And then after being at Colossae, he goes back to Ephesus. And then at Ephesus, Paul is joined by Timothy. Timothy comes with news of the brethren at Philippi. Paul sees a need. And so he's going to go somewhere else, to Macedonia, but he's going to leave Timothy in Ephesus. You stay here. I have need of you to work here, but I have to go to Macedonia. And then somewhere in Macedonia, and it's surmised that around the year 63, maybe 64 AD, is when Paul wrote the first letter to Timothy and also the letter to Titus to instruct the young men concerning their assignments that they had been given. In the future, I hope to do a study of 1st and 2nd Timothy as well. Very similar in some regards to the letter of Titus. But the tone in the second letter to Timothy is much, much different than 1 Timothy and Titus, because Paul, at that point, is in his second imprisonment. He's not getting out of this one. And so the tone is one that is writing his last words, if you will, to a fellow worker, admonishing him. That's not the tone that the first letter of Timothy and Titus carries. And so I'm sure for all of us here, it's sufficient when Paul says in Titus 1 and verse 1 that Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ. That does it for us. But for those who may doubt, for those who may question that Paul was indeed the author of this letter, a reasonable timeline can be given to demonstrate the probability of Paul's authorship. We can show with Scripture and putting pieces together, we can establish a timeline that demonstrates that Paul did have opportunity to write this letter. Even though Luke didn't mention it in Acts, he didn't have to. There are other pieces that we can put together. So we can be confident that Paul wrote it to Titus, the recipient. And very little is known about Titus. We're not given a whole lot of biographical background when it comes to who he was. What we do find in Scripture, the few times that he is mentioned, what we do see is a man of great faithfulness, not only to Paul in supporting him in his ministry, but also to the gospel. I mean, you imagine being a younger person, and Paul says, I want you to stay here in this place, in Crete, where they're having some issues, and I want you to help sort things out. I'm going to leave and go somewhere else. Excuse me? You're leaving me here? And I've got to take care of this? There were times when I was a plumbing apprentice that they would leave me on a job. They were allowed to do that with those that were enrolled in the apprenticeship program. And they would go get a small job started, and they would leave me there to work, and they would go start another small job. And I knew they were only a phone call away. Right? If there was a problem with the blueprints or something came up and the general contractor had a question, I could just, hang on, let me call. I'll get the foreman on the phone. We can sort this out. Titus wasn't able to do that with Paul. He wasn't able to just pick up the phone and give him a call and say, hey, I've got to run this by you. I'm not for sure what's going on. I need your advice. No. Titus had to be grounded in the faith and sure of the gospel for Paul to lead him in such a situation. Now, historically, it's put forth that Titus was a native of Crete, which is why it made sense for Paul to leave him there and work with the church. He knew the people, right? He knew the culture, he knew the language. It made sense to leave Titus there. We're not told necessarily that he is a Cretan, but what we are told is that he is a Greek. He was not a Jew by birth. He was a Gentile. And in Galatians chapter 2, in verse 3, Paul writing there says, "Yet not even Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised." He had not kept the old tenets of the law. The Gentiles did not circumcise for any reason. And so Titus wasn't. But Paul would write this to the Galatian brethren, setting forth Titus as the example that physical circumcision is not necessary for salvation. You don't have to worry about that. The Judaizing teachers, boy, they love to hold to that. That you had to keep the tenets of the law. If nothing else, you at least had to be circumcised in order to be counted among God's people. Paul says, no, it's not that way. Look, Titus is with me. He's a Greek, and he doesn't have to be circumcised. And I found it very interesting. There in Galatians 2, in the first 2 verses, we actually learned that Titus went with Paul and Barnabas to Jerusalem. And if I had known that before, I had forgotten about it. But the great gathering of what's called the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15, when this question of do we circumcise or not came up, and Paul and Barnabas made their way up to Jerusalem so they could convene with the elders there and the other apostles that were there to settle this matter of circumcision, does God expect it or not? Titus went with them. Now, again, Luke didn't record it in Acts, but listen to what Paul says in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 1. He says, "Then after 14 years I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and also took Titus with me. And I went up by revelation and communicated to them that gospel which I preached among the Gentiles, but privately to those who were of reputation, lest by any means I might run or had run in vain." Paul trusted this man Titus. So much so that with this big convention, if you want to put a modern term to it, he took him along. He understood what was going on. The need to know the full revelation of what God wanted them to do. Paul relied heavily on Titus for assistance throughout his own ministry. Paul did not treat Titus as just this little tag-along that was kind of learning the ropes. He used him in his own ministry. It seems to be that Titus was the one that carried the first letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. He was the one that delivered it to them. Titus was also the one there with them, encouraging them to do what was right. Look at what Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, beginning in verse 6. This is now the second time he's writing to the Corinthian brethren. But Paul says, "Nevertheless, God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus." Paul was comforted when Titus returned. Returned from where? He says in verse 7, "And not only by his coming, but also by the consolation with which he was comforted in you." He had been with the Corinthian brethren. Paul had sent him there with the letter to deliver to them, and you remember what mess there was at Corinth in the book of 1 Corinthians. And not only was he to deliver the letter, but he was to stay there and help encourage them to straighten up. Do things right. And we know from the second letter of Corinthians, they heeded the message. And they fixed things. And they were going in the right direction. And Titus comes back to Paul and he has this good news to report to them. That's why Paul is coming. Just because Titus returned. Yeah, he loved Titus. But it's because also of the message he was carrying. that the Corinthians had repented and they were turning things around. Titus had proven himself a hard worker for the gospel. So it's no surprise that Paul leaves Titus in Crete to work with the church there. He was the right man for the job, you might say. Having had a good track record of staying with congregations that needed help in order to turn them around and get them going in the right direction. Let's talk about the theme of the letter for just a moment. And I believe the theme for Titus is set forth in Titus chapter 1 and verse 5. Whenever Paul encourages Titus to set in order the things that are lacking. Set in order the things that are lacking. This is the first thing Paul writes after his salutation, his introduction to the letter. He says, "For this reason I left you in Crete, that you should set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders in every city as I commanded you." Now I want to stop here for a moment because the addition of chapter and verse numbers and section headings are useful in our modern Bibles, but sometimes they cause us to miss the flow of thought, especially in a personal letter like this. Because what do most of our Bibles have in them? But we have a little gap, right, between verse 4 and verse 5, kind of a new thought beginning, and we have a heading there that says qualified elders, or something to that effect. The qualifications of elders, something like that. And then that goes down through verse 9, and then we have another little space, right? Another division of thought, and then verse 10 says the elder's task. And so what we do automatically is we link this set in order the things that are lacking with just the absence of elders. That's the only thing lacking. Because, well, it's just in that section, right? He must be talking about the thing that is lacking is just the absence of elders, but that's not to be taken as a solitary statement. Paul is opening up his letter saying, I want you to set in order the things that are lacking, and here they are. Beginning with the need for elders, qualified elders, because the church needs shepherding. And then you get down into chapter 2 and you're going to find even more things that are lacking from a member standpoint. We're not just talking about leadership, we are talking about the church collectively. And so the theme is what congregations need to do, what Christians need to do in order to live sound doctrine. What corrections, what points of improvement need to be made in order to bring yourself under the will of God in totality? I want to address Titus's role for just a moment. Denominations will look to Titus and they'll look to Timothy, and they will use their positions, if you will, and to elevate the role of the preacher to being the pastor. Now, I want us to ask ourselves a question. Why is it Paul tasked Titus with these responsibilities? Why did Paul tell Titus, I want you to set in order the things that are lacking? And I think there's two possibilities. And I want you to decide which one is more plausible. Was it because he was the preacher? It's in the job description. This is what you do as the preacher. Did the position demand it? Now that he is the preacher and Paul has left him in Crete, he's over the whole show. if that be the case, then where does that put the preacher in relation to the elders? This is where denominations will point, and they will say, see, Titus was supposed to appoint the elders. Well, does that not make him in a position over the elders? The preacher does not have a role of authority equaling the eldership or even going above the eldership. And I think the second possibility for Paul giving Titus these instructions or responsibilities is the more accurate one. It's because Paul could trust him. Paul needed a man on the ground that he knew he could walk away from and go work somewhere else and be confident that things were being handled back in Crete. Titus did not have this official job title as the preacher, and that's why he was doing all these things. Titus was a faithful Christian. He was a Christian first, who also happened to evangelize. That's my job. I am a Christian first. I happen to preach as well. But my first responsibility is that of being a Christian. Titus was not a pastor. He was not given this position of supreme authority. He was just a trustable guy that was zealous about the gospel, that was zealous about following God. And Paul knew he could count on him to make sure things were done. Hopefully, understanding this little bit of background will help set the stage for the rest of our series. Lord willing, next Sunday we'll begin going through the text itself and start delving into the application for us. But hopefully this kind of gives you an idea of why Paul wrote to Titus. There were things on Crete that needed addressed within the local group or groups there. And Titus was given the responsibility of going around and encouraging them to make the proper changes. And those things that they were encouraged to change in are things that we ourselves need to be careful of. And we need to evaluate and see, are we living sound doctrine or are we not? Now, with this letter being written to a Christian, Titus, about admonishing other Christians, the brethren in Crete, quite frankly, it will not benefit you unless you are a Christian yourself. Ooh, harsh, you might say. Now, I don't want people sitting here thinking, well, good, I just won't come back on Sunday nights anymore. No, that's not what I'm driving at. My statement is not meant to be harsh, but rather serve as a wake-up call that you need to get right before you can start living right. We talked at length this morning in the adult Bible class that just trying to quit drinking as a worldly person isn't good enough. Well, that's a good goal to have. But what are you living for at that point? As God's children, we have a purpose. We have a hope that those in the world do not share with us, but they can. That hope has been given to all mankind. It's up to all mankind to accept it based upon the terms in which it was given. If you are here tonight and not a Christian, I've got to ask you, why are you waiting? What's holding you back? Surely it can't be the fun time you're having here. It can't be all the lavish things that you have that's holding you to the world. Whenever you boil it down, the thing that holds one back from being a Christian is just selfishness. I don't want to commit. I don't want to change. Overcome that tonight. Knowing that your life will be so much better with God in control, with God at the forefront of all your decision making. Living for Him. Living for Him will let one die for Him. And when we die for Him, our eternity is sealed. Are you ready to start living for Him tonight? You have the plan of salvation before you. If you have any questions regarding what it means, please let me or one of the elders know. We'll be happy to talk with you. If you know you need to respond, then don't wait. If you are a Christian and you have sin in your life and we can pray with you that God will forgive you, let us do that. However you need to respond to God's invitation, do so right now as together we stand and sing.